Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, you'll consider giving this video a thumbs up and possibly subscribing as well. What I'm going to be covering in today's episode is part 7 of my rather unique neck through guitar build. And what I plan to do is install the truss rod, a pair of carbon fiber reinforcement strips, and then I'm going to glue the fretboard onto the neck. Now, in a previous episode, I had mentioned that my plan was to press in the frets first, then I was going to glue the fretboard onto the neck. However, I prefer gluing the fretboard on first, then pressing in the frets. And the only reason I was going to do it differently was because I was concerned about getting this neck, because of its unusual shape, to fit into my fret press. But then I set it up and checked it out, and as it turns out, it'll fit just fine. So I can go ahead and glue the fretboard on before pressing in the frets. And the reason I like to do that is because once the fretboard has been glued into place, I can double check to make sure that the surface of the fretboard is perfect. I want to make sure it's absolutely flat and that the radius is consistent from one end to the other. So I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer and let you watch as I do this work. Now, the first part of this process is extremely important. I need to make sure that the surface, the mating surfaces for the fretboard and the neck are absolutely flat. And I'll do this by checking it with a precision straight edge. Now, with respect to the fretboard, it's not as critical because when you clamp the fretboard down to the neck, it will assume the shape of the neck. So I need to make sure that the surface on the neck where I'm going to be gluing the fretboard is absolutely flat. There can be no bow, no warp, no twist, no waviness. It needs to be absolutely precision flat. That way, once I've glued the fretboard down, I can be assured that there aren't going to be any gaps and that the fretboard isn't going to assume any of the flaws that are present in the surface of the neck where the fretboard is going to be glued down. And to make sure that it's flat, if, by chance when I checked it, I noticed that there was some imperfections, what I would do is I would take a long strip of sandpaper and attach that to a known flat surface like the bed of a table saw or a planer, or one of the things I like to use is I have it's like a shooting board. It's like 3-foot long slab of really thick MDF. And then on the top surface, I glued down a sheet of laminated floorboard, and it's absolutely flat. So I can attach sandpaper to it, and then I can sand a surface like the surface of the neck to get it perfectly flat before gluing the fretboard in place. So that's really important to do before I move on with the next steps. Okay, as you can see, I have 3 channels that are routed into the neck, and that is one for the truss rod, and then one on either side of the truss rod for the carbon fiber reinforcement strips. Now, the truss rods that I use are these 2-way double action truss rods. They're wrapped in plastic to keep them from rattling, and I get these from Bitterroot. So I'll put a link in the description below. You can go check them out. They have great prices on truss rods. But I just will simply press this in. And the slot that I cut for it was cut so that it is perfectly sized for this particular truss rod. And you want to make sure that no part of the truss rod is extending above the surface that you're going to be gluing the fretboard to. If that happens when you glue the fretboard down, any part of the truss rod that's proud of this surface will deform the shape of the fretboard as you're gluing it down. Obviously, you don't want that to happen. So that's basically all there is to installing the truss rod. And the carbon fiber reinforcement rods that I'm using, I purchased these from Geiker. I think it was on eBay. And they're basically about 1/8 of an inch thick, 1/4 of an inch tall, and I think they're around 15 inches long, something like that. But I just simply push them down into the slot like so. Now in truth, there's no need to glue these in, believe it or not. But just to play it safe, I'm going to add some CA glue. I'll just put a couple of spots of CA glue. Capillary action will draw it in to hold it in place, and it's not going to go anywhere. Now I'll just let that sit for about 10 minutes to let it thoroughly dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, it's been about 10 minutes. That CA glue is dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lightly abrade the surface with some of this. This is Norton's, I think it's the triple aught synthetic steel wool. I love this stuff. It's a great way to prep a surface without leaving a lot of steel wool fibers behind. But I can clean off any excess glue or any crud or anything that's deposited on the surface. And then I'll wipe it down with a clean paper towel. Now what I have to do is cover the truss rod with a length of masking tape so that glue doesn't get down inside that slot as I'm applying it. So I'll just lay the masking tape over that. The glue that I like to use is Titebond 3, and I like all the Titebond glues work well, but I like Titebond 3 because it has a longer working time. And that can be really beneficial when you're trying to glue up a fretboard. You don't have to rush it. Now, as you're doing this process, or actually before you start the process, you want to make sure you have all of your tools on hand. You want to make sure that you have all your clamps, everything ready to go. You don't want to be running around looking for stuff as that glue is tacking up. And then what I'm going to do is use a glue brush just to spread it around and make sure I have the surface all covered in a uniform manner. And then once I have this all covered, I will remove the masking tape. Then what I want to do is brush right up to the edge of the truss rod. Now you don't have to worry about getting glue down in the truss rod. It's not really going to affect it, but you just don't want to slop it over the truss rod. That's why I use the masking tape. And you want to also make sure that you don't get glue on the adjustment nut. But otherwise, don't be too concerned about glue around the truss rod. It's not going to make that much difference, especially since the truss rod is wrapped in plastic. If you're using a different kind of truss rod that doesn't have that plastic wrap, then you might want to be a little more careful. Now, a lot of folks will ask me, why don't I use alignment pins or registration pins or calibration pins, whatever you want to call them, to line up my fretboard? And the reason is it's not necessary when you make your neck and fretboard on a CNC machine, because the taper shape of the fretboard matches the taper shape of the neck. Now, one thing I did do is I I know that the nut I'm going to use is 3/16 of an inch thick, and that the face of the nut on the tuner side starts right where the angle of the headstock begins. So what I did was I measured back 3/16 of an inch and drew a line across there, and that line is going to be where I position the fretboard. What I'm going to do before I attach the fretboard is I'm going to take some table salt, and I'm just going to take a few grains. I'm going to sprinkle them, just a few grains, in a couple of spots. And what this does is the salt will act like an abrasive, like almost like sandpaper, and it will embed into both the neck wood as well as the fretboard wood. And that will keep the fretboard from sliding around. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use squeeze clamps to temporarily hold the fretboard into position. And I'll do this, and I'll leave this here for about 5 to 10 minutes. Just long enough for the glue to start to tack up. Okay, so 10 minutes has gone by, and I am going to begin clamping the fretboard down. And to do that, I'm using, this is just a simple clamping caul that I made a while back out of some MDF. It follows the same taper as the fretboard, and it's got 2 strips which focus the clamping pressure to the outer edges. So then I will begin by attaching my clamps, my C-clamps. And I'm not going to do, massive amount of clamping pressure here. It's not necessary. Also don't want to apply so much pressure that it break the wood. And then I'm going to let this dry for a couple of hours, probably overnight, just to play it safe. Really, I could get away with just an hour, but I'm in no rush, so might as well give it plenty of time to cure up. All right, well, it's been 24 hours, or roughly thereabouts, so it's time for the big reveal. So I'm going to take off the clamps. Perfect. So now what I'm going to do, this is really the moment of truth. It's perfectly level. There is no warp, no bowing, no high spots, no low spots. It's perfectly level. And that means that fine-tuning this radius is really just a matter of probably sanding it up to its final level of finish, which will probably be around 1500 grit to get it really super smooth. Then I'll start to install the frets. So that's not too bad. And I can also double check the radius. Sometimes when you use a clamping caul that puts pressure on the edges of the fretboard, it'll press them down a little bit so that it doesn't quite match the radius that we're shooting for. And that's exactly what's happened here. It's right now, if I wanted to call this guitar a 10-inch radius, it'd be perfect. But if I want it to be 12-inch radius, it's a little bit off. So I'll probably take my 12-inch radius sanding beam and sand this to fine-tune that radius before I install the frets. But that's the reason why I like to glue the fretboard onto the neck before I install the frets. That way I can make sure that the radius is perfect. Now that the neck is, for the most part, completely finished, I still have to put the frets in, I'm going to let this hang up back here in the shop probably for a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, I'm going to focus on making the halves for the body. And the reason why I'm going to let it hang for a couple of weeks is because the process of making a neck, carving it out of wood on a CNC machine, and then gluing the fretboard down puts a lot of stress on the wood. And that can cause the wood to move a little bit. So by hanging it up for a couple of weeks, the wood fibers can relax, and the tiny amount of moisture that was present in the wood glue, because remember, wood glue, Titebond wood glue, is water-based. So to make sure that all that water has completely evaporated and that the wood is dry to its natural state, it's going to take a couple of weeks. And before I actually commit to using the neck, when I'm ready to glue the body halves on later on, I will check to make sure that nothing unexpected has happened as this neck was resting. I want to make sure that there's no warping or bending or twisting that can sometimes happen when you put a block of wood through the stress of carving it. And I'm pretty confident it won't. I've made a lot of necks over the years, and it's rare that that sort of thing ever happens. Especially when you select wood that has such perfectly straight grain from one end to the other, and is very, very dry to begin with, but it's also got the carbon fiber reinforcement strips under the fretboard. So I'm pretty confident that this neck will be good to go in a couple of weeks and everything should be fine. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it. If so, give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, again, welcome. I hope you'll consider subscribing. And until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for the next episode.